with yet another special guest, and this time from, I think, British Columbia, Canada, right? The other
Yeah,
side.
Canada.
It's still early. It's still early out there.
Yeah, it's
Probably
early
cold.
here. Yeah.
All right. So I have with me Dr. Paola Lake, and she's a psychologist, and her expertise pretty much in post trauma, issues, military and otherwise. And part of health, obviously, it's just both physical, mental, and psychology is a big deal. And we've had a very tough year, and it's still going. And we've actually brought to you guys in the previous show a little bit of the basics of psychology and psychoanalysis with a different guest. Today, we're going to focus a little bit with Dr. Lake on the concept of trauma and how it happens, what the causes, what happens to the folks, why they can't sometimes cope with it. Some do, some don't. And then in the environment that we live in, what's causing it as much, and how we can maybe prevent it, or maybe some tools. Now, also, Dr. Lake has her own show, the Dr. Lake Show and podcast, and so please check it out, and listen to her feed as well as information. So with that little introduction, I want to give it back to Dr. Lake to tell us a little bit about you and your practice and your background, and then we'll start getting into the COVID business.
Sure. Well, I've been in practice for quite a few years, and it's kind of morphed over the course of the years. I've definitely specialized in trauma. I work with the public, but I also work with. I do a lot of work right now with RCMP officers here policing in Canada, primarily in British Columbia. And as well as veterans. So it really has been moving progressively more towards any kind of trauma. It can be childhood trauma, but of course with policing, a lot of it is the traumas they encounter through the course of their work. And it has really a lot of impact on people. And I think trauma is the one thing that it is, when it really at the more severe levels, is really a big challenge for people to get past that experience of the traumatic impact. And so that has been a big part of my focus. I probably, through the course of my education, my career, it was always about overcoming adversity. And I think in life we can't avoid adversity. And this experience with COVID has been a really prime example, because people's life moved from a place of maybe of more certainty and now into fear. And when we are in a fear state, it really impacts and it can bleed into all areas of our life. So that has been my passion. Right from the get-go, I actually had a local radio show here that I hosted for a period of time. And that one was all about resiliency. And I interviewed a number of authors at that time. And it was because that's been my fascination, is not about can we will all at one point or another in our lives have something that we have to encounter. So it's how do we build that sense of resilience internally within us, and how do we not let the past experiences shape the rest of our lives? And because we change as we go through experiences, we start to change. And I'm always interested in how you were before trauma and how it changes you. It literally changes the way you view the world, the way you respond to life. And I've seen people's life go from being full and present to much more enclosed and sort of avoidant of the world. And so how do you get back to where you were before trauma? And that is a really big question. I don't know if I have all the answers to that, but I know that it's important that we address that, because it's just something we can't avoid in life. And we need to build those tools and skills to be able to deal with that.
So, Doctor, I have a few questions, and we'll get to a few of them
Yeah.
in the next. But so, everybody knows the word trauma, right? So I think it would be ideal if we can define a little bit what trauma means and what levels, because there's physical trauma, there's mental trauma, but like, what is it exactly? I mean, how do you identify that you're really being traumatized? And maybe that's just the clarity that people may need about maybe they go into it, they don't even know. Uh, is that even a possibility?
I do have my own way, and I think it's been sort of mirrored in my practice about what trauma is. They've actually differentiated, they called it big T, little t. I don't know if you've ever heard that.
No, that's exactly what.
Big T is those major, everyone thinks of trauma, you're seeing death, your life, is threatened. And that would be in the big T category when I work with RCMP officers and their lives are at risk. Or we've had a traumatic experience, a break-in, or our lives were threatened, or we've witnessed something that felt very threatening to our integrity. That would be the larger uh, type of traumas that can be very sudden, unexpected, immediate, and those can have really profound effects on people on a very deep level. And I would say at a primary level, their feeling of safety in the world gets negatively impacted, so that their lives start to get shaped to prevent themselves from having to go through further adversity. And in doing that, they may curtail certain aspects of their life that are important. For example, when I'm working with an RCMP officer, and if he's gone through a lot of major traumatic exposure through the course of his career, what will happen is the most simple activities that maybe you and I go and we go shopping and grocery shopping, and it's not a big deal for us. For them, going in a public environment where there's lots of people becomes a highly stressful experience, and that they go through heightened arousal. They struggle to do the very basic things that you and I take for granted on a normal day-to-day basis. So those are the more profound kinds of traumatic impact, or childhood sexual abuse, where I've worked with some individuals that have had long-term childhood abuse, and as they have grown into adults, they still live their lives as if there's threat around the corner that they're going to get hurt again. And that's a real compromised way of living. And when we look at the little t events, it might be maybe not as much a life-threatening type of incident, but one that still has a profound change. Whether someone might have been bullied, or they had maybe a certain number of experiences of abandonment that they feel they can't trust in relationship anymore, and as a consequence they don't put themselves out there anymore, they don't take risks, or they get in a hyper fearful vigilant state. So I think we underestimate the impact of some experiences. They don't always have to be life threatening, but they can still shape your life in a negative direction. And I like to think that we, in the absence of any trauma, we still take risks in life. We still put ourselves out there, but it almost creates a state where your life ends up being shaped by trying not to have danger and an overestimation of the types of risk. An example would be, I've worked with some people that have had maybe some bullying in their childhood. They feel a lot of shame, and as a consequence, they won't look for jobs. They won't go out there to meet new people. So suddenly your life, the possibilities in your life seem to diminish once you've gone through these experiences, and you don't put yourself out there anymore because you play safe and keep yourself safe. It's an overestimation of danger. And that's the hardest thing I find when I'm working with the more severe end of trauma, is how do you create it so that they can feel safe again in the world, and that they are able to put themselves in what would be otherwise a normal situation, whether it's shopping or going out and meeting people, and not live in this state of fear or anxiety that, if you put yourself out there, something bad is going to happen.
So quick question. Well, I want to just take a quick pause since we talked about police and policing, and just a thank you to all the men and women in uniform across, all nations and all around the world for all the good work they do. And I know there have been some negative vibes, in different scenarios over some of the events in the world, but overall, all men and women out there that are, really risking lives day in, day out. I mean, it's not easy. And, we fear for our lives without even having to volunteer ourselves into it. But some of these folks go out there on their own and just basically, they know that there's a risk, and their
Yes,
risk is much higher than most of us would experience or think.
absolutely.
And that's a big, so again, from our, show here, as well as on behalf of Dr. Lake, thank you for all
Yeah,
the good work and great work you do. So one of the transitions I want to go over is uh, PTSD, right?
yes.
So is that the ultimate big, main diagnosis?
I would probably say, yeah. I mean, one thing I really like to differentiate with people, though, is you can be diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, um, and suffer significant symptoms. I don't know, how much you've talked about this in your work, but the hallmarks of PTSD are having intrusive symptoms that, memories of past traumas that you do not want to have that keep intruding. A lot of physiological symptoms of arousal, very difficulty bringing that arousal level down, a tendency to try and avoid anything that will bring you back into that memory. So, they might not walk down a certain street because it reminds them of their trauma. So their life gets shaped around it. But, I would say to people that you do not have to be diagnosed with PTSD in order to, I can certainly say some people have trauma and they might not fully meet that criteria for PTSD. So you can still have some symptoms that are disturbing enough that I think need to be addressed. But they might not meet that full spectrum of PTSD. Most of my practice with RCMP officers, they do meet that criteria, but I can meet the public with perhaps interpersonal traumas where they've had some abandonment. It's really shaped their ability to cultivate relationships or trusting relationships. They might not still meet that criteria. So, I don't really get fixated on that diagnosis, although often it ends up being part of what I'm dealing with. Yeah.
So just a question. Some people say, okay, well, military uh, personnel, they actually engage in more troublesome areas with a lot more death and destruction, and their level may be a little different from, for example, a local police force. Not that it makes a difference. I mean, ultimately, the danger is as real, and but some folks maybe, well, you can't compare the two. We're out there with bombs and crazy stuff going on, whereas the other ones are comfortably patrolling, and uh, is there anything that we can tell folks about? Is First of all, is there a difference? Because in terms of the way the mind works, um, that's the first part of it. Is there anything we can say specifically to that point?
You mean in terms of how they develop the symptoms, or
Well, I
is,
mean, so
yeah,
one is like, basically it's a bigger event that they experience with multiple, bodies and things that they can see that
yeah,
are completely can forget. I mean, I give you an example. I was
yeah,
long time ago, I saw just an accident, and I can still visualize that accident in front of my eyes every time I
yeah,
think about it. And
yeah.
and it was literally like, wow. So that's just a personal experience. But when someone sees that level of crazy, I mean, it's the impact is probably high, but does that equate to someone that is local, for example, and maybe their experience is much less, crazy?
That's a really good question. When often if I'm working with military, they will have gone on tour. So
Yes.
it's sometimes they might have had one tour, they might have had several tours in the course of their career, and it's an intensive exposure to life-threatening situation. Some of them have been in Afghanistan, some of them have been in Bosnia. They've seen some horrible things. They
Exactly.
may or may not have been injured, but it was enough sometimes to see a lot of death and see these, or perhaps even play a role in those deaths.
Right.
And you know, when I'm dealing with, for example, RCMP officers compared to veterans, it's not always that they run into that short, intensified period of repeated exposure to trauma, but it's a repetition of exposure over the course of 20 years or 15 years or 10 years. And so sometimes what I've noticed is there's a cumulative impact that happens, and not after the first death they witnessed. And what's interesting, this is often what I'll hear from officers. They may have witnessed hundreds of dead bodies and been exposed to hundreds of situations, but it might be that one incident after 10 or 15 years of work that suddenly gets to them. And they may even go, I don't understand how I could have seen all these bodies and dealt with all of these situations. Why now? Why this death? And I think what we're really looking at is there is a bit of a cumulative impact that over the years, I don't think trauma happens in isolation. And so military, you know, if I was to look at military and RCMP right now in Canada, they did a major study, the Canadian Mental Health Association for Mental Health did a major study, and they looked at RCMP officers. RCMP officers, compared to the normal population, their rates of trauma are higher. So their rates of mental health disorders are higher. And so I think when you look at the context of an individual that develops PTSD, whether they're military, whether they're PTSD, there are some predictors to why they might develop the symptoms. And if you look at the life of an RCMP officer, police officer, for example, um, you know, they're often overworked. They're on a sleep schedule that taxes them. When they're doing shift work on and off, their body, they get mentally and physically fatigued. So our resources for managing adversity diminishes as our well-being diminishes. So if you're not actually engaged in healthy day-to-day lifestyle patterns, enough sleep, overall, it's as if our resilience starts to weaken over time. So I do think there's a cumulative impact for police officers. It's a slightly different phenomenon for military because they will have a 3 month or 6 month exposure, and then it might die down for a number of years. So I still see a lot of police officers struggling with similar symptoms to that of military. And another precursor often for the development of trauma is are ones who've had previous trauma. So if there's been trauma in your childhood or you went through a lot of adversity, you know, there's a higher likelihood for anybody, if you've already had a childhood experience of trauma, it kind of creates more vulnerability in your later years as an adult to re-experience some of those symptoms of trauma. So what we're doing sometimes, even though I'm dealing with what they went through the course of their career, it's not uncommon for me to also end up traveling back into their childhood and kind of remedying some of the things that they didn't really get, those skills we're supposed to get in our childhood that build our resilience. They end up having to work on that sometimes even after they've developed a trauma later on in their career.
Wow. That, I mean, that's got to be some interesting when you have to deep dive and to the root causes that may have been built in for over their life. And certainly, to your point, there's events that may trigger episodes or basically
Absolutely.
spikes.
Yeah,
Now,
absolutely.
now someone could really ask about, the type of trauma. So we've talked about maybe being in a dangerous situation and things like that, but it could be just observing something that is wrong, or like
Yeah,
just dealing with social problems. I mean, it could be
yeah.
as simple. I mean, if you're always getting into domestic calls or bullying situations and you have to constantly see that, maybe that has to have some sort of an impact. that you'll bring back to your family and to your, surrounding, your
Yes.
environment.
So the impact that that trauma has in your personal environment,
Yeah.
it colors the rest of your relationships. It truly does. I mean, that's why it's so important for us to address the trauma itself. And some of the things I see happening to people who've gone through trauma is it affects their relationships at home. They're less present. It's much more difficult for them to be patient. Irritability tends to increase. I've had some officers, for example, otherwise very easygoing, kind and pleasant individuals, find themselves having outbursts in their home that is out of their character. So the reason it becomes so troubling for them isn't, you have the trauma itself, but it's how it starts to affect your coping in life. Substance abuse is, it could be using anything they can use to help them
Deal
calm
with it.
that intensity of their emotion. And so we're always trying to help them develop tools for coping that doesn't end up being destructive to the rest of their lives. And that's what's so scary about it for them, is because it's not just the fact that they have this original trauma, it's that they see their world unraveling, and it triggers a lot of fears that they're not going to be able to resume the kind of life that they had, or that they're going to even destroy their relationships, find themselves alone, perhaps maybe even in their career it will have a negative. And that's a big fear, because I work with some senior officers, I work with ones that are new in their career, and there's this implicit fear they develop that if I can't get a handle over what I'm experiencing, I might actually not be able to do my job anymore. I might not be able to carry a relationship anymore, or my partner might leave me because I'm no longer the person I was. And they don't recognize themselves anymore. And they sometimes, a big thing I deal with when they're dealing with trauma is their self-concept. There's because, I mean, if you might imagine, for police officers and military, they're still a militaristic based
Sure.
organizations. A lot of what they learned in their career was to be strong, pull up their socks, tough it out. And I think they enter into their career with that mentality. And once they start recognizing, hey, that's not working. And as much as I came into my profession, it can work up to a certain point where just pulling up your socks isn't enough anymore. And sometimes they come to me very reluctantly and very cautiously, because one of the things people fear is that if they go to see a psychologist, that they'll become blubbering softies and they won't be able to go out there and do their jobs anymore. And so, I have to kind of re-educate them and let them know that absolutely not, that's not what we do. It's actually to strengthen their resilience, help them deal with adversity, and make sure that it's not going to negatively impact their career. So that's a big educational component for them, that they have to learn a little bit of normalization of just the fact that it's pretty normal when you see things that most of us don't see from our day-to-day lives, that you're going to have a reaction. And then they get humbled. It's a humbling experience, even when you've been worked your way up to a sergeant position, to suddenly go, well, I thought I was invincible, and now I'm realizing I actually have to deal with this stuff, even though I really don't want to. That's a lot of the process I work with them, is educating them and helping them feel that they might have to deal with some of this stuff, but in the end, it's going to help them be stronger. And it takes some time to get them to that point of trusting that process, right?
Now, are these cases, for the most part, being assigned type of things, like maybe like departmental, position that they tell, okay, you're a sergeant, you've been through this, you need to see somebody special to treat, whatever, or this is because there's the stigma, right? I mean, if,
Yes.
if I have to volunteer myself just to go and maybe see you, I would have to think about everybody and what they're gonna think, and I probably
Yeah.
want it to be a secret.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
how does that work in that environment?
That can definitely, that happens where there's a referral and there's a concern for particular police officer. Right now, there's been a lot of work at destigmatizing trauma. And there's a lot more education actually since the national study that has been produced in Canada. And there has been a lot more incentives to educate police officers, give them resources, help them normalize the need to talk about it. We do have critical incident stress debriefings. So, you know, as the incidences surface, they will enlist a psychologist to come in and let's talk and educate. There is still, in my opinion, a long ways to go on destigmatizing it. But it is for the newer generation, they are improving in the educational front. And so what I'm finding now, compared to when I first started years back, is I do have more of them willing to come in, even in the beginning of their career, and they're saying to me, I'm ready to work on building my resilience and so that I don't end up suffering from trauma. But that, I don't think that would have happened years ago. And so I do get more self-referrals. The other one would be, you know, often it's been once they end up experiencing symptoms. So never in the beginning of their symptoms, often when they're finding they've tried to just pull up their socks and continue, and they come to me after they go, in spite of my efforts, I've been unable to master it. But it is changing. And I think I'm really hopeful that that will change for them, that they'll be able to just take that, you know, I think as a preventative is just a good practice for people to learn tools for their own well-being over the long run. You know, I think another change that's happening in these organizations now is historically it was very much, there's a lot of pressure right now, the capacity for police officers, for example, to do a lot of overtime. Historically, they did tons of overtime. Their life was really off balance. Now there's more of an attitude of, okay, it's okay for me to do some self-care, because that is really important for preventing trauma, is that they get the rest they need, that they take care and they listen to their bodies. Whereas historically, I think they literally cut off any internal sort of awareness that they were even struggling with something. And, you know, and that's when problems tend to surface. Now they're actually paying more attention. I still think there is a ways to go, because, you know, I remember one quote that I heard, it was, you know, we can change even a law or we can change a principle, but it takes a long time to change a mindset. And that was such a ingrained perspective for them to be the tough people that weren't touched by anything. So I think we still got a long ways to go for educating and helping them feel more comfortable with the idea that it's not a sign of weakness. Doesn't mean they can't do the work. And if anything, I want them to know that it's the opposite to that, that they're actually going to be stronger because of it, because of that time that they take for themselves.
Now, if you don't want me to ask, so the folks that you've helped, do you see? I mean, years go by. Do you see like? Do you even come across them in real life and maybe like see that the change that happened based on the impact and what you've done with them? Are there any of them that come back to you and say, "Hey, listen, you changed my life"?
Yeah. Yes, there are.
All
Yes,
right.
there are. You know, it's, if I'm going to classify it, you know, I think there are some individuals who, when the thicker their trauma base, like the more, if they've been riddled with trauma from the time they were young and they went through a lot of adversity, and the more they continued perhaps on an unhealthy form of coping, whether it's alcohol or over the course of years, those take longer. And I will work with some that have more challenges in overcoming the full scope of the trauma. We for example, there's one of the symptoms that's common is hypervigilance, which means they can't relax. They're constantly looking for signs of danger. That's a huge one with police officers. So even if we may help them with all the other symptoms, they have these residual symptoms that, I can't say that they all just disappear. There might be some residual things they have to learn to cope with. But for those that have had more simple trauma, and what I mean by that is they haven't had the full scope of trauma from the time they were children, that it's really been confined to one or two events. Those they can make progress fairly quickly, and when they come into the force with those resources in hand, like support, relationships, a greater balance. They started on the right footing from when they were young. Those are the ones I'm more likely to see them come and say, that was amazing. I'm in a way better place. So absolutely, it can happen. I would just say that it really depends on the nature and severity and length of traumas that they've been through that will make a difference on how quickly they can proceed and get better.
So I find it very intriguing or interesting that
Mhm.
you've had cases of law enforcement agents or officers who have potentially had some level of trauma when they were younger.
Yeah.
And I know for a fact that most of the agencies out there, all law enforcement, you have to go through some scrutiny before you get in, and part of it is psyche, evaluation. They do all those pre-screens. How does that not make it? How does that get not noticed at that stage? And it takes a real event once they're in the career path impact them. I don't know if I don't want to go into the deep secrets here because that's a pretty technical question.
Yeah.
But if it happens, I mean, certainly it's happening. There is a filter, a criteria where before you get into, there is a enough scrutiny.
A
Uh,
screening process.
yeah, a screening process. Yeah.
Yeah. Most officers are screened before they go in. They do a fairly thorough assessment. We might administer the MMPI, and they go through a process of interviewing. And, uh, that's a really good question. I mean, what we're really looking at is, through the screening process, are there any major psychiatric conditions that we see them come in with? I mean, like any screening process, people may or may not downplay certain traumatic experiences they've had. But I think the other piece is that, even if it's such an optimistic time when they're entering the police force. Sometimes if they've had trauma, it's their mission to want to be out there and help people, and they go into it with a really uh, a positive intent to really change the world, and maybe even fix some of the problems that they ran into when they were younger. And so when we're doing that testing, it's at a stage in their career, or when they're very hopeful, and that place of optimism is great. But they may even underestimate it, as might even a psychologist who's doing that testing. Whether they absolutely go into details of what they went through or not is another story.
Sure.
But
It's
I
an
do
interview,
think,
right?
yeah, but even if they're feeling okay and they've had previous trauma, we can actually think we're fine, until we encounter those situations. There are some officers that I know of that just launched into their career. They encountered a couple of incidents and then they immediately pull themselves out of the police force because it was
Wow.
just too much for them right at the outset. Others that just are able to use that pull up your sock approach, it can last them up to a certain period, right? I do think it's really important, if they've had previous trauma, that if they've put themselves in a really positive situation, let's say they're in good supportive relationships, they found some solidity and built some resources. It's not a definitive that they're going to experience trauma. It's almost like a vulnerability point. There's no guarantee someone's going to experience trauma because they had it in their childhood. Statistically, it's just been linked as a greater risk factor. And so if you were to collectively look at what are all these risk factors, lack of self-care, poor social resources in your life, past childhood trauma. And if you collect those risk factors all together, and if the higher those numbers are, the more at risk they're going to be. And so we can't exclude everyone who's gone through some experience in their childhood. And ultimately, it depends on how they end up coping through the course of their career.
So just a question about diversity. Does the background of person, whether it's the economic, socioeconomics or, culture, religion, has an impact on how they deal with trauma in terms of coping and also just like making it happen through it?
That's a really good question. If there's any link that when we look at trauma, we look what are maybe some precursors to trauma. I don't know that they've associated it so much with, in this cultural background, your greater likelihood. But what they have looked at is particular mindset that a person may possess prior to encountering traumatic situations. For example, one common thing that I see is for those that have been maybe historically had a greater tendency to blame themselves for failures, ones that have had a mindset to engage in what we call maladaptive thinking styles. So individuals who look at themselves and blame themselves for anything that goes wrong, or they tend to overgeneralize when something bad happens. They look at the world as if it's in a more generic negative way. So it's those thinking patterns. It might be associated with culture. I mean, I'm an Italian culture. Italians feel guilt all the time. So I think there are certain mindsets that we can derive from a culture. I don't know that we've directly linked it to that culture, but we've certainly looked at mindset, and mindset is a contributor, and that can play into how someone deals with life. Like I'll often look at what was your thinking style, and what was your thinking style. I deal with, for example, some veterans, and one of the big issues that they might have is even guilt. When you're in a war situation, and there's a lot of coulda, shoulda, woulda, and if some people can make better peace with the fact that they were in a difficult situation, and under that circumstance, they did the best that they could. While others walk out of the same scenario with a already tendency to feel the weight of responsibility, that they should have somehow accomplished things that they could not have feasibly done. Or even in the course of their role, I know some that have had to engage in difficult activities. It might include killing, if that's what it included. And they wear that, and they carry guilt, and guilt is a really challenging thing for someone to knock. And I can't honestly speak to what it's like to ever have to kill somebody. I don't carry that burden, but I do think it's one of the more challenging burdens that people have to carry, is feeling responsible for the life of other human beings.
Well, is it more because, because I mean, there's two levels, right? I mean, there's self-defense. If you're really just, in a case or situation, somebody, it's either you or them,
Yeah.
in the context of war or policing. But then you have the context of like, well, did I do the right thing, or because I was given orders? I mean, because I think there's a difference between someone that's engaged in person and someone, for example, that is
Huge.
from the back end.
Huge.
So
Absolutely.
it gotta have an impact.
It has. In fact, I've certainly worked with some military that one of the biggest struggles they had is they were following orders. They were doing what they were mandated to do. And in spite of the fact that that was a mandated task that they were enlisted with, there's that internal
Compass.
self-doubt, right? Where they think if I didn't do that, this would never have happened. And the thing that's interesting when we go through those kinds of traumas is they keep looping the same question over and over. And they're not, it's harder to, as much as you might try to reassure someone and you say, listen, you did what you were told to do. It's under that circumstances. It's really hard for them to hold on to that and without feeling and carrying some kind of responsibility that they should have done something else. And that can take years actually to help them make peace with themselves, recognize that under the circumstances they may not have been able to do anything different. I think it's one thing that any of us who have not been there, and that's why I have great respect for them, because I'm not going to be the person to tell them that they shouldn't feel a certain way. I can't imagine what it would be like to have played a role in someone else's demise. And that's a burden, fortunately, that most of us don't have to carry. But I certainly don't think that they deserve to carry that burden for the rest of their lives. I think it's a walk a mile in my shoes, and then maybe we could know what that's like. And I hope that they can get past those experiences without that kind of burden, because I think it's a heavy burden to carry for many.
It is. And it's funny because most of us in the normal world, we would not, we may judge people, like, we may judge those folks, like,
Totally.
but if we were to be put in their shoes, as you stated,
Yeah.
what was I mean, it's funny because I use that in training, and I watch a lot of like strategy movies, war movies, also like, disaster movies. And
Yeah.
I use those in training mode. And then you ask the question, well, which character would you have done? What would have been your reaction in this case? Would you have been character one, maybe choosing a peace way, or maybe the character two that actually just, shoot first, ask questions later. So,
Oh,
so it is very difficult to really, and you don't know because unless you're in it.
that is a thing. And I think a lot of them might actually end up um, being surprised by their own reaction. I mean, we can conjecture all we want about how we're going to handle those situations.
Exactly.
One thing I do know is when we are physiologically aroused in those moments of traumatic experiences, if you understand what happens to the brain, when we are in a fight or flight state, when we're in a state where our lives are
Really.
threatened, actually our brain is compromised in that particular moment and we are not thinking. If you actually look at the brain of a traumatized individual, there's a lot of activity happening there. And they have a term called emotional hijacking, which refers to when we are in these altered states. If you actually look at the brain, this part of the brain that is the one that has us plan and think ahead, and it's very methodical and strategic, basically shuts down. And the blood actually gets constricted, the blood vessels in the brain, and there's less brain activity in this frontal lobe, which is why, for example, even if we're looking at road rage,
Right.
people do things that they would not otherwise do. It's when we are in these states is as if half of our brain is shut down. And that's why I think it's so hard for people to be able to anticipate what they're going to do in those situations unless they've actually been there. And we're operating with half of our brain functioning, basically. And I think that's why it's so hard for them to come to terms with the fact that, when they're in those types of situations, they couldn't think as clearly as they might have otherwise. It's so easy when we're out of it to say what we should have done. And that's half the battle for them, is to come to terms with that.
Wow. So, I mean, listen, we could talk about this for a lot of time. I mean, we started the conversation
Absolutely.
about we want to go over COVID stuff, but
Yes.
it was so intriguing. Like, when you mentioned it, it's just there's all questions that people might have or don't even
Huge.
understand.
I
I mean,
know.
I'm
Yeah.
sure it's a deep dive topic, and we can spend hours. We probably
Hours.
would not give it justice, right? I'll do it justice to it.
Absolutely.
So no, we'll just go right segue into the current scenario that we live in for the
Yes.
last year, and it's still ongoing. So COVID,
Good. Good.
it's kind of came in, from somewhere. It happened, and now the world has to deal with it. And a lot of folks, throughout the year, either through the last year, they either did good or did bad in
Yeah,
terms of how they managed their resilience.
yeah,
In a way, some people just took the best of it, and some people, but again, not everybody experienced it the same way. Some people had loss in the family, or even,
huge.
themselves had, traumatic experience going to the hospital. In the
Absolutely.
beginning, it was scary. People are still scared. I mean, just as an example, I was with my mom at a doctor's today, and there was an older gentleman that was just doing a stress test and came out, and then he needed to eat, so he was just snacking. So he took his mask off. And then someone walked in. She made a
Yeah,
big deal scene because she was traumatized about him being without a mask, and
yeah,
it was just like an interesting scenario because the guy just came up with from test that he needed to get some food in him because he was fasting all morning. And here comes a lady that is completely like off, and she went into attention like, well, you shouldn't be doing that. It's risking our life. So I
yeah,
was watching that. It was an interesting, exchange of opinions in there. So
yeah.
it's been rough. So if you can just guide us over like some of the things that you've seen over the last year, and and maybe some suggestions of people how they can actually really move away from that and maybe cope with it better,
Yeah.
in light of all the resources that we're looking at in the future months.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things I do know is that uncertainty, when, we all like to live in a world where we can predict our future and know what's ahead of us. And if you look at when we are in a place of certainty, we feel more relaxed. And this is not unlike the trauma that I was talking about before. Something like COVID is triggering again that people's fears and their sense of uncertainty. I mean, if you put aside job uncertainty, then you look at uncertainty about your own well-being or that of your family. It's a very natural response for people to have heightened anxiety, and I don't. The last thing I would ever want to do is pathologize the fact that uncertainty is a very provocative situation for people, and it will inevitably result very often in anxiety. And because I deal with lots of different types of uncertainty, and COVID just happens to be one of them. It could be a divorce, it could be a loss of a job. And as soon as people don't have that control anymore over their lives, there's a very natural response to go into a heightened state of stress and worry about it. And if someone has, if you, much like I was talking about before, there's often a correlation that people who didn't cope with adversity well in the past might also have perhaps a little bit more difficulty coping with this type of adversity, because again, it brings up safety issues. And when we come, that's, I think, why you see a lot more volatility. If you look in I remember seeing some clips on TV of people in supermarkets
Oh
yelling at
my
each
God.
other, and
I know.
and because when we are in fear states, it actually, we go back to this brain thing happening again. We're no longer grounded. We fear our safety. We go into fight or flight. That is exactly what I think happens when we're looking at the volatility that happens in people. That has been a common thing that you'll experience. So I think in order for it's the ultimate test for people to learn how to cope with uncertainty. Very often, one of the things that we will suggest when people's lives have been sort of in upheaval, or even job changes, or working from home, or having to adjust with children, that when there's a lot of change and fears that are happening, really important for people to have some anchoring type of activities in their life, not to completely change their lives, develop some kind of grounding rituals from day to day that are have some kind of stability. Because when all your whole life changes and everything feels uncertain, those are what we anchor ourselves in. And it could be time that you take to go for that walk, spend time in nature and unplug, and to do that on a regular daily basis. So when we have a lot of uncertainty, anchor yourself in some of the things that you know have been calming and good for yourself, and to commit to those so that your whole world isn't turned upside down. And I think because of the amount of adjustment people have had to do, it's easy for, that's the first thing people will start to let go of. They'll start to completely put their needs aside, and they go into this survival mode. And those anchoring things are really, really important. I think nature, exercise, eating well, making sure you're sleeping, and finding a support system in order to navigate this. And what you really want to do is help them get out of that frontal lobe, loss of function. You want to get them back. One thing I say is, we want to put your brain back online.
I like that.
I actually really believe in a lot of the meditations that are out there right now to help people get out of their head, because no amount of rumination and worry actually helps people. It actually will make things worse. So those are some of the things I think are important. And, if you've had a tendency, for example, to catastrophize in life, whenever there's a hiccup in your life, you see the whole world falling apart. Well, COVID is no different. And, if that is a pattern that you have where you start to catastrophize and think the worst, and then the chances are that things actually will get a little bit worse. So we got to rein in those cognitive tendencies to go into panic or go into fear states, and start to reevaluate and do some self-soothing techniques. For example, even as your mom is there, she may not have had a lot of control over that circumstance, and her fear is what kicked in, right? And feeling that her life was at risk right in that
Well,
moment.
no, it wasn't my mom. It was a lady that walked in.
Was it? Okay. Well,
Yeah,
there
yeah,
you go.
yeah. So
Yeah.
so it was interesting because they walked into the clinic, and she was just like going, crazy and screaming, and screaming at the receptionist, like, she shouldn't be here. And there was also a language barrier, so it was even more interesting. So it was just a perfect example of like the reaction of folks, and I've seen it in other places, not the
Yeah.
first time. And as you said, we've seen it on TV. It's viral on social media, and it is just a reaction. And when it's I'm basically defending myself to your point, and that's what she's thinking at that time. I don't want to be exposed to anybody, and it shouldn't. But then she is also infringing on that person's ability, but she doesn't understand what happened at that point. It's tough. It's tough. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
no, go ahead. Oh, sorry, you mean to cut you off.
No, I mean, there's that would have been for me a fear response, and I can appreciate people would be scared. And what do we do when we're scared? Sometimes we get angry.
Yes.
Sometimes we get, she was in fight mode, and other times they might have just flown out of that building and said, "I'm never coming back here." I mean, all of it is how do we soothe ourselves, and calm ourselves. And if you don't have tools to do that, and then your next response will be to act out. And um, you know some people will overestimate their risk level, and they will feel absolutely like something bad is going to happen to them. And I do think it's important to be able to do a little bit of time and evaluate, where is my thinking, and what can I do to calm myself? Are there things I can control when I'm in those situations? So that I can bring that arousal level down. If you have that tool to calm yourself, the thing that meditation, mindfulness, exercise can do is it speeds up your recovery time to a trigger. So if there's an event that is inherently provocative or stressful, that you have a better ability to bring it down. And if we don't practice that, if you don't do that, the probability is that you're going to be more reactive. And So that's why you're actually wanting to exercise your brain, so that as you become better, you can delay a response. You can be more contemplative in how you're going to deal with the situation, rather than going back to the amygdala part of the brain. It's the emotion center, and which is more primitive. And that's what comes out of us when we're in stress states, is that primitive fight or flight response, which is probably what your mother had witnessed there. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's for her. I mean, it's funny because another reaction one time that happened more recently is that this just to lick my mom. Somebody walked in front of her. She ran away because
Yeah.
she's been so conditioned that all she's been watching is the news, and she's an older lady, so she hasn't been actually out maybe like a few times this whole year. And at home, we actually try to remain a little distant from her and things like that. So it just happened that someone walked by her where she didn't expect it, and she literally jumped and ran away to
Of
avoid
course.
them.
Yeah.
It was
I,
just like a crazy mode.
I have an aunt in Italy, and she of course in Italy, the situation with COVID
It
was
was crazy.
very,
Yeah,
very extreme. I mean, they required documentation to permit them to leave a perimeter around their home.
go to the store.
Otherwise,
Yeah,
they couldn't leave. But her story is she goes into a grocery store and she's sweating profusely. And imagine, I think the more vulnerable you feel, and she's a senior, the more vulnerable you feel, the more it could feel like your life is at risk and you're just going shopping. I mean, the things that should otherwise be safe, they're now thinking that they might be at risk. So I appreciate that feeling of vulnerability. And I think learning how to work with it, and certainly helping finding ways to do what you need to do to feel as safe as possible. And I think ultimately we need to all work together here. But I can appreciate that if you're older, senior, you have health issues, that now you're going grocery shopping, and now it feels like your life could be threatened. And that can be a pretty scary thing, to think about. Right. But I do think doing what you need to do to feel safe, I do encourage people to do that. There might, if you look, and we look at even in the States and here, there's been overestimation of risk, and then there's underestimation of
underestimation,
risk. And ultimately, we want to find that nice balance
middle ground. Yeah,
between the both. We don't want to go into denial that there's anything happening. There's a book called The Gift of Fear, and it's all about we don't want to eliminate all feelings around it, because that activates us. That's what helps us stay safe and do
mhm.
those things. So somewhere in the middle there, I think, is important for people to learn that balance, so that they're not completely going into these panic states. Right.
And you're right. There are two. I've seen two extremes. There are people that really don't care. And we've seen them
Oh,
also on the media say, it's my right. I don't want to wear a mask. I don't want to do anything. And then you have the extreme opposite side, which like if they see anything, like they wear the mask in the vehicles, you know, it's a little,
absolutely.
it's crazy, like the spectrum level from one end to the other. And I'll
Okay.
give you a joke. Again, my mom's case.
Yeah.
So she's been under this medication for years. And one of the side effects is coughing. Now, we all know
Oh,
coughing and COVID is not really a cool thing to
yeah.
do in the public. So now when she goes out, she's actually almost suppressing her coughing because she's afraid that people will look at her
No.
like,
Yeah.
oh, it is the most insane, reaction that I've seen from her when she's like, she's trying to hold her cough. And I'm like, Mom,
uh,
it's
you
okay.
know
You can cough. You have a mask on.
I totally have sympathy for that, right? Because I mean, I have asthma,
Oh,
and
exactly.
and so I'm out and I'm going, oh my gosh, I don't want,
People
because
look at you like,
will scare
what
people,
happened?
right?
What's going on?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah, yeah. It's a new world out there. I'm telling you, it's very challenging, and one thing I think we don't want to make it abnormal that people are having reactions to these experiences. We're all kind of trying to figure out how to navigate this. I'm big on compassion, and if you're struggling with it, people that are struggling more. I do really think it's important to find the support resources, because what I love having these conversations. I think it's important for people. And I also think that sometimes, it may or may not be enough. And I do think it's important if you're lacking that kind of support, that you need to find a way, because everyone's situation is very unique. And sometimes they need to address, perhaps if they've had past trauma, like I've mentioned before, this can actually reignite something for them too, right? When we're worrying about safety. If I could share one observation though,
Sure.
is a lot of PTSD clients that have maybe, uh, avoidance is one of the symptoms of PTSD, which is they avoid anything that might trigger their reactions. Some of them have loved COVID and have loved that it's legitimized their experience of staying home. It's how them feel that now they don't have to justify to anybody why they don't like to go to grocery stores, why they don't, and they feel like this has been made for them. And I've had one person say she feels vindicated because now she can stay home, but so is everybody else in the world having to stay home, right? So
Everybody's pretty much gone through the same thing. So,
a very mixed response that to this experience. Yeah.
so quick, just, I mean, we're almost past the time, but it's
Yeah.
just so interesting. One question: have you seen a surge in folks seeking help, in this COVID time? And is there enough help out there?
No,
I
there's
mean,
not enough help. That honestly, I've had to date, I've had a waiting list since for already 10 years in my practice. But it's been probably, I would say, yes, there's been an increase. Anxiety, depression has increased for people. So yes, do I notice a bigger wait list? Maybe, maybe yes. I think right now I'm hoping, as far as psychologists goes, we need more. We need more practicing psychologists, at least in BC. I don't know what the status is there in New York, or, as far as resources. I do know here we need more. And it's really what I feel really badly about is that I have to turn people away, and I only cross my fingers. I do provide them with resources. I do know government funded places offer free services to people, but I also know there's huge wait lists that can be, for some, they wait up to a year. So we are having challenges in that respect. And I do hope we get more, even if it's peer counseling or some kind of more resources in place for people, because sometimes it's just having that individualized attention that makes a huge difference for people.
yeah, and I think, I mean, it doesn't help that people are still afraid. They don't want to go anywhere. And telemedicine, I mean, is pretty cool right now with like something like this, a consultation, somebody can really,
Yeah.
but I think there's also price, cost, and fear. And to your point,
Yes.
not everybody can afford services. So it's a little challenging.
Well, here's a good thing, and this is what I think is really good, and I would encourage people to know that right now there's a lot of online clinicians. So,
That's
and
good.
so literally, if you want to actually see somebody, you do not have to stay within. If you're going to do online, you can actually. I could meet with somebody in New York if I wanted. So the geographical limitation that existed before doesn't exist now. So for a lot of practices that have moved their work online, I would say if you are meeting a lot of wait lists and struggles to get in, expand your search and know that there's a lot more possibility now to see people across different areas geographically.
Well, that's great advice because I don't think people are aware that that's possible.
It is
Because,
possible.
yeah, but to your point, I mean, everything we live in a cyber world. I mean, everything is
Sure,
online. I mean,
sure.
this is a good example. You're like 3 hours
Yeah,
away. We're
absolutely.
still here. So,
Yeah.
believe it or not, I have a show tomorrow morning, and it's actually from Australia. So,
Oh, there you go. Well,
so,
yeah,
so it's really an interesting concept where today it's, we live in a
it's
very
big.
accessible world.
Yeah,
And but it
absolutely.
just that people have to leap forward towards it. And people are getting more savvy
Yes.
with technology and stuff.
Do a
Well,
crash course. crash course.
Doctor, it has been a true pleasure. We had a
Thank you
very
very much.
interesting, and informative, talk here, and I've learned a lot. I hope that our audience here has actually benefited from all the advice and the definitions, the different types and things. And I mean, I know you mentioned earlier something about bullying, and I think that's a whole different topic itself. So I
Yes,
will,
yeah,
that may be a subject for a different discussion. But
love it.
hey, there you go. But maybe we'll hold to that one. Hey, so
Absolutely.
I'll hold you to it. But
Okay.
definitely, it's been very there's a lot of stuff that we've learned today. So and
Thank
and,
you
and
very
again, as
much.
always said, if we can teach one or two things in one show, and people can
I
walk away with a
agree.
couple items, that's good enough.
Yeah,
And
I appreciate
so
it. Thank you.
yeah, so thank
It's
you
great to
for
be here.
I
Thank
know
you for
your
having
time
me on.
is your time is expensive, and I appreciate that you actually extended a little bit with me. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you
And
very much.
so with that, I will just close the talk show today. So thank you for watching the iHealth channel and listening on iHealth Radio. Hurricane H here with Dr. Lake, and we'll see you probably tomorrow. Ciao, ciao. Bye bye.
Bye-bye.